Hi everybody, this horse is Shammy. She's, I believe, just turned 5, and she's going to have her first fitting for a saddle. And so one of the first things we do, if the owner was here or the rider, we would measure them and get their measurements, especially their length of leg measurement. But I'll be riding this horse to start with. And so first what I'm going to do is we keep track of their circumference. Just in case next time we measure them, we're not sure if they gained or lost weight, which can affect the saddle at times. So we want to just have a baseline. She's 77. And then we find where the saddle support area is, the length. It's right at the back of the scapula, and it goes to where the hair comes together. You run it up here, or you can just find where the last rib is and follow it up. It keeps curving under that longissimus muscle. So she's right there. There's the back of the shoulder, and I'm going to measure that area because it might determine what model of saddle. She's very, very long back. So we're looking at a 19-inch to 20-inch. We always go with the shorter length, which would be 19 inches. That's quite a long saddle support area, so we don't need to worry about panels on the saddle. But you would never want to go past that last floating rib, because you get into a very weaker part of the horse's back, and there's no ribs anymore. They're just little transverse processes, that they call them, on the lumbar vertebrae, and they stick out like little wings. They stick straight out. This is your lumbar area, everything past this point, the last rib, to here. They stick out straight like this, and so the saddle, if it extends beyond here, is going to hit those before they hit the ribs, because these stick out a little bit higher. Plus you have a mare, you got your ovaries, you also got the kidneys and everything else there. But this is the strongest part of the horse's back. This is where you want to sit. This is why we love the Peter Horrigan saddles. They put you right there because you're over the horse's central axis as well. And so the further back you get, the weaker the horse's back is, and actually the more motion. So think of the sitting trot. If you start sliding back, it gets much, much bouncier. But if you can stay to the front of the saddle, it's generally a lot easier, a lot less motion. So then we're going to do a wither and shoulder tracing. And somebody may say, well, why are you tracing the shoulder? The saddle doesn't go on there. You're absolutely correct. But the shoulder can influence the saddle a lot. So what we have is, if you can have one shoulder is bigger than the other. It's a free floating joint, so it can develop differently. But most common, we have the right shoulder forward, which means if you look over the horse's back, and if you find where the scapula is on both, then you can see if these line up or not. So if you take where this back of the scapula is, you got to make sure the feet are square. Okay, now I'm going to do tracings of her wither shape and also her shoulder shape. Now people would say, well, why are you tracing the withers or the shoulders? Because we don't put saddles there, at least you shouldn't. But the shoulders play a big part in influencing the saddle at times, because the shoulder is a free floating joint. There's nothing keeping it lined up like a clavicle. And so very often one shoulder can be bigger because it's more dominant, or most common is that we have the right shoulder forward. And if all of you should start looking, because until I started saddle fitting, I didn't realize this as well, is that if you were to make sure your horse is square, find the back of the scapula here and find it over here, and then just go straight up. Does it line up? Or you can actually just look over the shoulder. She grew up in pasture, which is really great, and they tend to be more square in the shoulders, and she's very, very slightly right shoulder forward. Not anything that would influence a saddle. So as a saddle fitter, I'm not going to worry about that. But also they can have two different sizes of shoulders, two different shapes, and that can influence the saddle as well. Got to watch these young horses, they get a little antsy. So you can always look over your horse's back, and that's sometimes why I ask for photographs. I want to see your horse from over the back so I can see the shapes of the shoulders and stuff. So I'm going to quickly do that and trace it. So we go over the widest part of the shoulder, make sure everything's nice and perpendicular to her. And then we trace it. And you can probably stop there. Okay. So we just make a tracing of the shoulder on top, the wither underneath. And we can always use that for reference also next time we see the horse, because this is going to change so much. It changes on young horses simply because they grow, and then it changes on the older horses that are done growing, but they will muscle differently depending on the work they do or the work that they don't do. So I can actually tell how a horse is developing, if they're developing in a good manner or not. This other tool here will show us a whole lot more about that because it does track the top line. Now the next thing I do is this is a Springer gauge, and we use it to measure the horse's shoulder angle, because if you haven't watched some of my videos before, it's so important that we adjust the saddle. The gullet plate should be lined up with this shoulder angle, not the wither angle. This is very common, much too common to see when saddles are lined up with the wither, because the shoulder then has no place to go under the gullet plate of the saddle. Horses move so much better when they have that freedom up here. So I'm going to use the Springer gauge. I just line it up with what her shoulder angle is. There we are. And this is very important to track as the horse grows, because a lot of young horses, they start out very flat like this, then they start to get withers, and then they can even broaden again. I've got horses that I've been doing for about 5 years, and it's like watching a picture book. You know, you can flip through it and the shape changes. Is pretty amazing. So the measurements give you a lot of information, and then you combine that with what you see, and both of those things should match up. So she's got a 5.5 Springer angle, which is pretty decent. And now we're going to, and this is a little bit harder part on a young horse, because she needs to stay very square. As you can see, this has wings on it, and it has numbers attached to it. So these will tell me how even she is from side to side, and then these numbers will be set as to what her top line profile is. And this is great, because some saddles, the horse hasn't changed very much other than the top line. So the saddle starts to sit in a different place and in a different way. It could start bridging, different things like that. She's actually pretty darn square. We'll see if I can get this done really quickly before she moves. Good girl. She's actually a great horse. Just young is all. We can't be upset at them for that. Good girl. And unfortunately for Shammy, it's feeding time. Feeding time can be a very distracted time. Okay, so I'm going to basically set this, and I'll go back down and make sure that she's standing square. And this is a good tool to remotely fit saddles. If I can get these measurements, then it's easy for me to just turn it upside down and put it in a saddle. Oh, I think we got it. What a good girl she is. So then what I do on my evaluation sheet here, I want to keep this tool out away from her, is that I write down these numbers, and this I can replicate. And it's really interesting if you take a horse's past measurements, adjust this and set it on them, and you can visually see how much that changes. The problem is the back changes slowly, right? And so we don't often notice how much it's changed, but this really will point that out, and it's very, very helpful. It's a useful tool. So even if I don't have the horse in front of me, I have these measurements written down, and in the shop I can replicate it if I need to. And as I expected, she's pretty even across her back. She's actually got a very nice back. We're working really hard to improve it and preserve it. A lot of young horses start to use their back, and then people get afraid that they're going to buck or something, so they make them hollow out a little bit, which makes you feel safer, but that's not what we want for the horse's development. Okay, so now we've got this measurement, we've got the wither tracings and everything. We also have a section here that we go through the conformation of the saddle support area, because every horse is shaped a little bit different, And depending on what that conformation is, we really need to make sure that we double check certain aspects of the way the saddle fits. So it's it's a sloped shoulder, is she a straight back, is she right shoulder forward, is she even in the loins? All of these things that affect saddle fit that it's just a double check system, okay? And it correlates with where we fill out this part about how the saddle actually fits. So if you have a downhill build horse, then you're gonna have to raise the front of it or lower the back to keep the angle. She's gonna be very, very easy because she's got such a nice developed back, okay? Okay, so I haven't drawn out on this horse, but I have it in a lot of information in different places about what exactly we're looking for, and we draw out the horse's saddle support area and everything. The feed cart's coming really soon here, so I want to get this done very quickly because we are ready to start getting on her. So I'll just explain it from the point of view of having a saddle on, which is also good for you as well. So Sarah, you might want to get in the front.
You want me?
We're going to talk about the angle.
Sure.
So I already brought up the topic of the angle of the gullet plate, which is the steel part of the saddle. It has to be still and it has to be rigid to keep the saddle off the horse. What's the purpose of a saddle? Number one, to keep you off the horse's spine and to disperse your weight over the largest area you can within the horse's saddle support area. So when we talk about finding, and I have a video just about all of this, is that when you find the horse's shoulder angle, you have to put it on the flat of the shoulder here, because if you think of the shoulder going through like this has got to mimic this angle so it slides through very easily like this. Otherwise it's going to be hitting. Most saddles that I see, unfortunately, are adjusted like this. So this matches the wither, but then this is where the shoulder goes through, so it totally blocks it, and horses don't want to go forward. Very, very important part. Probably the biggest thing that affects horses right away, because the minute they lift up their foot, that starts to go back. So we look at the angle of the saddle here. This is if you look at this right here, most gullet plates will follow that angle. And then we compare it to, she's not being very cooperative, we compare it to this angle right here. Make sure the saddle's on square and that she's straight. So if I look at it like this, you can see. So if you look at the angle of the gullet plate, which will almost always follow this line right here, versus the shoulder angle, if I put my hand like this, gotta make sure she's nice and square, and if I put it like this, it's pretty darn close. This saddle's very close to fitting, but she is so broad across here, I want to feel a little bit more room for the shoulder to slide through here. But other than that, this is pretty nice. What you'll often see in saddles is that they've been adjusted to the wither, so it sits here and leaves no room for the shoulder to slide through at all. In fact, a lot of the weight is taken right there. And so that first step that the horse takes, they meet resistance. So yes, can they go forward? Will they go forward as freely? No. Will they go forward as comfortably? No. So this is probably the biggest thing that right away will make an influence on the horse, either good or bad. Okay, so we've already talked about how long she was in her saddle support area. This saddle doesn't even come close to the length that it could be, so we're really good there. And if we look at, you might want to get on this side, Sarah, so it'll be easier for everybody to see. And by the way, thank you, Sarah, for videotaping.
My pleasure. Yeah. Always educational. I love it.
So if we look at the balance of the saddle, it's not too bad at all. What you want to look for is the middle of the saddle is the lowest point. So if you take the length of the saddle, find the middle and come down, you'd like that to be the lowest point. So what I need to do to this is I need to widen this a little bit and then maybe bring the angle in a little bit steeper. So we keep that balance, but we create a little bit more width there for the shoulders. So the other thing that we look at is the width of the channel right here. This is at least 4 to 5, and she's definitely 4 to 5. Now, why is this important? There's several reasons. along the horse's spine, there are tendons and ligaments. This is a muscle. Muscle acts differently than tendons and ligaments do. Tendons and ligaments, if you have the saddle too narrow and it actually sits on there, they can become inflamed and get very, very sore. What happens when that horse's back gets sore, they tend to drop them away. Just exactly what we're trying to do, the opposite. And you also have to think that you limit the horse's ability to bend in the spine. The wider it is, the more the spine can oscillate back and forth. And think about it, when we try to bend a horse, we try to get them to bend in the middle. That's why if you get their back up, they can bend so much more easily. The other thing you have is there's multifidus muscles that connect, we have them also, that connect each vertebrae to each other. So they're diagonally connect the vertebrae. And so if you put a lot of pressure on there, then it traps those muscles, they lose their flexibility, and a horse will almost always hollow. So really important that this be wide enough up here in the gullet channel, that's what we call it. Okay, so we're good on all of those aspects. We're good on the length. We're gonna fix the shoulder angle. We can actually, and this is why my favorite saddle, I know that there's others out there that can be adjustable, but dealing with all of them, this is my absolute favorite because I love it where it puts you at the base of the wither on the horse, which is super important, especially we're getting a lot of these brogue style horses and stuff. And so Peter's done a great job of putting you in the right place. And having a beautiful saddle also, which aesthetics are nice. Now, the one thing that I'm gonna suspect, because this is a little bit high, and we need to widen that a little bit, is that we're probably bridging a little bit under here, which we are, meaning that when you run your hand under there, you want to have even contact all the way evenly underneath the saddle. A horse, if they lift their back even, doesn't just lift right here. So that thought that, well, you got to leave space for the back. No. When the back lifts up, look what happens. Come on, girl. See? The back lifts, so the saddle changes balance maybe, but it won't fill in that spot. Now, it will fill in that spot if a saddle is flexible enough when you sit on it, but for that to bend in the middle, you've got to add extra pressure on the four corners of the saddle. So you want really nice even contact. It's more comfortable for the horse by far. Now our billets line up really nicely. You want these to come straight down where the girth groove is. Saddles can slide forward or backwards, and that's often a problem with the billet placement. Okay, so we pretty much covered that. You're gonna see me actually adjust this saddle, which is really cool. And if anybody's out there making saddle choices, there's a lot of options, but I would say one thing, definitely get a saddle that you can actually put in a tree machine, but adjust it in width. So we're talking about, she's very wide across here, so I need to have enough width, then I need to have the proper angle. If you can't adjust those two things, you're never going to have that perfect custom fit to the horse, which is so important. We're asking them to be these big athletes and really do beyond what they normally would on a longer time frame, and so we need to make them as comfortable as we possibly can, and we can't contradict what we're trying to get the horse to do. We want them to lift their back, but if your saddle is pinching in these areas, they're going to hollow. So what do? You get bigger spurs, bigger bits, whatever, but you have to use a lot more force to counteract what your saddle's telling them to do, and that's just never a good situation, is it? So we'll adjust the saddle. Okay, so we already talked about the saddle's upside down, of course, so you have to envision it like this, but the distance between here and here was too narrow. So I want to open this up a little bit, and then we'll check and see if we need to change the angle at all. But we put this as pretty self-explanatory. We put this in this tree machine. There's a handy little tree machine here. And I put these felt pads in here just to protect the saddle. But once you've been able to do this to a saddle, it's just so frustrating to try to work with saddles that can't do it, because this is so very important. And this means that you never have to get rid of your saddle. You just keep adjusting it for as your horse changes, or even if you get a new horse, you just adjust the saddle. And you know, we all know what it's like when you get that saddle nicely broken into your own shape and stuff, and then have to get rid of it because you get a new horse or your horse changes and you can't fix it. Because when a saddle goes out of balance on a horse, it's almost always because the horse has changed, especially in the shoulder and the wither area. So if you can't change this angle, the only option is to flock it, but that flocking does not change that angle of the gullet plate. So you're really not doing anything much for the horse's benefit. You make the rider feel better because they're more balanced, which helps the horse to a certain extent. But then they're starting to fight, shoving their shoulder under a different angle there instead of just letting it slide right through. So to be able to do this, to me, is the ultimate. So as you can see in the video, how this is starting to widen that out. I don't want very much. We weren't very far off, so that's probably about it. People always ask me, well, how far do you know how to go? Well, just after doing it so many times, you get an idea. And I have in my mind what I want it to be like. So that's how simple it is. And how can you deny how wonderful that is that if we were riding this horse, I would put it on the horse, we would be able to do a dust pattern where we ride with no pad, where we can see exactly where the saddle sits. And if we need to tweak it one way or the other, depending on what the rider feels or what the horse feels, we can immediately do it, put it back on until we can make it perfect. And, I think we owe it to the horses. So that's why I'm so sold on this system. And so let's put it on and see what we think. Okay, now this is what makes me happy. I have so much more space here. So I'm gonna check and see if I've lost any of my balance of the saddle. I really haven't, but I've gained this space. So I'm very happy about the way this is now, because there's nothing I find more confusing than people want to use their old beat up saddles on these young horses to break them in because they don't want it to get damaged. But you have to think about it from their perspective. This is their first introduction to somebody being on their back, and either we're going to make it a painful experience, difficult experience, or we're going to make it where the saddle actually works in your favor, helps support your weight, disperses it, and makes a horse, even though she's got this she's a big horse and she's got a big, strong looking back, that doesn't mean it's ready to carry you. So it takes developing the horse correctly so they continue to lift you up, and you don't ever want to encourage them to do the opposite. So if you have a bad fitting saddle on a young horse, and they're just immediately going to want to drop their back, and pretty soon that's their way of going. They think that that's the way it is. And then it's even harder to get them to start to push up and engage and start to carry you. So we cannot talk enough about the importance of how saddles fit. And especially those points, I know I went through them really fast. I will someday make a video that's a little bit more detailed, but she just got her food delivered, so she's not going to be very happy sitting here much longer. So anyway, this is Shammy's first fit on a saddle, and pretty soon you'll see a video of her being ridden. So that's great. Thank you so much for watching.